I got the deal of a lifetime on a 1920s duplex, but there was a catch. Of course there was a catch. The price was rock bottom because the previous owner had passed away right there in the house. Now, everyone I knew tried to talk me out of it. They went on and on about the constant drafts, the ancient plumbing that was probably one flush away from total collapse, and most of all, the weird smell in the basement. It was a strange odor, a mix of dusty, rotting linen and something else. Something vaguely sweet and spicy, almost like ground cardamom. Honestly, the smell was the least of my worries. I figured I could air it out, maybe get a few industrial-grade dehumidifiers. I could handle the smell. What I couldn't handle, what I wasn't prepared for, were the whispers. At first, they were so faint I thought I was imagining them. I'd be in the kitchen making a cup of coffee, and I'd hear a tiny noise from the other end of the living room. It was like someone clearing their throat or a subtle creak as a person shifted their weight on the old floorboards. I'd freeze, listen, and then go check. But every single time there was nothing. The room would be empty, still, and silent. It was easy to dismiss. It's an old house, I told myself. Old houses make noises, it's just settling. But then the noises graduated. They became conversations, and the terrifying part was, they weren't coming from outside. They weren't coming from the neighboring unit through the shared wall. They were coming from inside my walls, traveling through the heavy, thick plaster and lath. It was always muted, this indistinct dialogue, like hearing a radio playing 3 or 4 rooms away. You can't make out the words, but you can hear the rhythm, the cadence, the emotion. And the emotion was what got to me. The tone was always strained, urgent, and just laced with this palpable, heart-stopping panic. It was the sound of a desperate argument, one that never resolved, just looped. I started trying to map where the sound was coming from, pressing my ear against different walls like some kind of crazed sound engineer. It was strongest near the original hearth fireplace, a beautiful old brick structure that someone had boarded up probably 50 years ago. When I'd pressed my ear to the cold brick, the voices were right there, buzzing like a swarm of furious trapped insects. Over time, I started to distinguish the voices. I became obsessed with them, with this ghostly drama playing out in my home. I determined there were always 3. There was a high-pitched, frantic female voice, always on the edge of hysteria. Then there was a gravelly, deeper male voice, constantly arguing, cutting her off. And then there was the third one. This one was different. It was a low, repetitive monotone. It sounded less like a human voice and more like a machine or a warning signal. It didn't participate in the argument, it just provided this unsettling rhythmic undertone. I became completely convinced that I was hearing an echo of the past, maybe the last moments of the previous owner's life. An argument replaying eternally, trapped in the thermal memory of the bricks and plaster. It was a fascinating, if terrifying, theory. And I almost wish it had been true. Last week, a huge storm rolled in. The rain was hammering against the windows, wind howling, the whole classic horror movie setup. And inside, the voices changed. They weren't just panicked anymore, they were screaming. Full-throated, blood-curdling screams of sheer terror. I couldn't just listen anymore. Drawn by some morbid curiosity, I walked over to the fireplace and pressed my entire palm flat against the wall. I could feel it. I could feel the vibrations of their terror, a frantic, buzzing energy transferring from the wall right into my skin. It felt electric. And in that moment, with the storm raging outside and the screams vibrating through my bones, I had a flash of chilling clarity, a realization that dropped the temperature in the room by 20 degrees. I wasn't hearing the past. This wasn't a memory. I was hearing something trapped in the present, something happening right now, echoing from an adjacent dimension built entirely of plaster and shame and fear. That's when I snapped. The constant whispers, the arguments, the screaming, it was too much. All the fear and frustration boiled over. I ran to the garage, grabbed the heaviest hammer I could find, and went back to the fireplace. I just started smashing at the drywall next to the boarded-up hearth, right where the sound was the loudest. Dust that smelled like old cardboard and decay flew everywhere, coating my lungs, my clothes. And as I worked, the screaming inside the walls peaked. It rose into this single unholy shriek as the hammer finally broke through the last layer of plaster. But I didn't hit brick. I didn't hit pipes or studs. My hammer broke through into an empty, dark void. My heart was pounding in my chest. I had created a jagged hole about a foot wide. It was an access chamber of some kind, completely sealed off, built directly into the chimney flue itself. It wasn't on any of the blueprints. It was a secret. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I turned on the flashlight and shone the beam inside. The space was small, maybe 4 feet square and a few feet deep. It was completely empty, bare brick and mortar, but the air that wafted out hit me like a physical blow. It was that smell from the basement, but 1,000 times stronger, overwhelmingly, cloyingly sweet and spicy. It was cardamom, wet, fresh, and powerful. My survival instinct finally kicked in. I stumbled backward, ready to run, to get out of the house and never look back. But before I could even turn, a sound came from the void. It wasn't muffled by the wall anymore. It was perfectly clear, sharp, and so close it seemed to vibrate my teeth. It was the low, repetitive, monotone voice, the third voice, and this time I understood the words. Crystal clear, it said, "You let the outside in. We had it contained." I didn't even think. I scrambled, grabbed the huge, heavy bookcase from the other side of the room and shoved it against the wall, covering the hole. I used duct tape to seal the edges, as if that could do anything. I haven't slept since that night. I just sit here, watching the wall, listening. This morning, my worst fears were confirmed. By the base of the fireplace, right next to the bookcase, was a small pile of dust. But it wasn't drywall dust. It was a fine, reddish-brown powder. I knelt down, my hand trembling, and touched it. I brought it to my nose, pure, freshly ground cardamom, and as I was kneeling there, holding the proof in my hands, a sound echoed through the room. A deep, painful, gravelly cough. It was the man's cough, but it didn't come from the wall. It came from the floorboards right under my feet. They're not contained anymore, and now I'm in here with them. Thanks so much for sticking with me through this terrifying experience. If you have stories like this, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content. Stay safe out there. My job isn't exactly glamorous. I'm a film restorer. Sounds fancy, right? What it really means is I spend about 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, hunched over a light table, staring at old, scratched-up film stock. We're talking about forgotten reels from the 1950s and 60s. These aren't Hollywood classics. We get the M-grade stuff, amateur films, home movies, student projects, the kind of things that never saw the light of a projector outside of a family living room. They're fragile, decaying memories, and my job is to save them from turning to dust. About a month ago, a new canister landed on my desk. It was a standard 8-minute reel, rusted around the edges. The label was faded, written in elegant, looping cursive. All it said was, "The Shoreline, 1958. I threaded it onto the digitization machine, curious as always. Most of these are pretty standard fare, but you never know when you'll find a hidden gem. The film flickered to life on my monitor. It was 8 minutes of a family vacation. A man, a woman, and a small boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old. They were building sandcastles on a vast, empty beach. The sun was high, casting long, soft shadows. It was silent, of course, and the film was grainy, the colors washed out by time. But there was something beautiful about it, a quiet, simple moment of happiness, frozen in amber. The father, tall and smiling, helped his son pat down a turret. The mother, in a modest one-piece swimsuit, laughed as a wave washed away their progress. It felt peaceful. I was about halfway through the digitization process when I saw the first anomaly. There's a sequence where the father stands up, brushes sand from his hands and points out toward the ocean, seemingly showing something to his wife. I followed his gesture, scanning the horizon line, and that's when I saw it. In the far distance, right where the pale blue of the water met the washed-out sky, there was a tiny, perfect black geometric shape. It looked like a floating monolith. My first thought was that it was a boat, but it was too sharp, too precise. The edges were perfectly straight. It wasn't a bird either. It was completely still. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting. It was impossible. It just hung there. I paused the transfer and zoomed in. The shape had a distinct, unnatural metallic gleam, even through the decades of grain and decay. It reflected the sunlight in a way that just felt wrong. I figured it had to be damage to the film. A scratch, a chemical burn, something. So I initiated the digital cleaning protocol, trying to isolate the blemish and scrub it from the frame. But the shape, it wouldn't budge. It moved with the film, perfectly tracking the camera's slight, almost imperceptible panning motion. It wasn't damage on the film, it was an object in the sky, captured on the film. It was part of the original image. My heart started to beat a little faster. This wasn't normal. I let the film play. For the next few minutes, the family continued their innocent play on the sand, completely oblivious. But my eyes were glued to the object in the sky. It was growing larger. It wasn't moving toward the shore, not in a conventional way. It was moving downward from the horizon line, descending slowly into the frame. The person filming seemed completely unaware. The camera stayed focused on the family, but the object kept sinking, growing, creeping into view. It was as if a spider was lowering itself from the ceiling, and no one in the room had looked up yet. The feeling of dread was overwhelming. I knew with a certainty I couldn't explain that the camera operator hadn't realized how terrifyingly close it was getting. And then it happened. Just as the monolith reached about a third of the way down the frame, now large enough to be an unmistakable, terrifying presence, the reel dissolved into 5 seconds of violent, pulsing white noise. The image tore itself apart in a flash of static, the audio feed crackling with a sound like a million insects screaming at once. It was a complete corruption of the data. My screen went white, then black, then white again. When the image returned, the beach was empty. The sandcastles were there, but the man, the woman, and the small boy, they were gone. The camera was still pointing at the same spot, but the family had simply vanished. And the monolith. The monolith was closer. It filled maybe a fifth of the screen now, dominating the sky. And it was no longer a simple geometric shape. It had changed. It was now shaped like a massive, dark, vertical eye, like the pupil of some colossal, unseen creature. And it was staring directly at the lens, directly at me. I ripped my headphones off and slammed the stop button, shoving my chair back from the desk. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I was breathing in short, sharp gasps, and the sterile, controlled air of the soundproofed booth suddenly smelled acrid, like hospital disinfectant. A cold sweat trickled down my back. What the hell did I just watch? My supervisor, a jaded veteran of the industry named Frank, came over to see what the commotion was. I tried to explain, my voice trembling, pointing at the frozen image of the giant eye on the screen. He just squinted, took a sip of his lukewarm coffee and shrugged. "Old film breaks down, kid," he said, patting my shoulder. "That's a massive solar flare burn during the transfer process. Corrupts the data. Happens all the time." He walked away without a second glance. But I knew what I saw. A solar flare doesn't make a family disappear. It doesn't turn a monolith into an eye. I went home that night, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that image, the empty beach, the giant, silent, watching eye. The next day, I couldn't stay away. I had to know. I went into the archive, my heart pounding in my chest, and pulled the original film reel, not the digital file. I needed to see the physical damage, to prove to myself that Frank was right. I spooled the fragile celluloid onto the manual editing deck, my fingers fumbling with the clips. I scrolled frame by frame through the end of the reel. It was all there. The 5 seconds of static weren't just digital corruption. The film itself was scorched and warped in that section. The emulsion bubbled and melted. The missing family, the giant eye. It was all there, burned into the physical medium. But as I examined the last few frames under the table's magnifying lamp, I saw something new, something I had missed on the digital transfer. In the bottom right corner of the final frame, below the terrifying image of the vertical eye, the dark emulsion was slightly disturbed. It looked like a tiny, deliberate scratch. My curiosity overruled my fear. I carefully took my razor, clipped that small, almost microscopic section of film, and placed it under the high-powered microscope we use for detailed analysis. It wasn't damage. It wasn't a scratch. Etched into the emulsion, so small you needed maximum magnification to even see it, was a single, perfect line of handwritten text. It looked like it had been burned directly onto the celluloid with a needle-fine point of intense heat. 5 words that made the blood freeze in my veins. It said, "He saw us watching." My breath hitched. The room felt suddenly cold. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, was what happened next. As I went to put the tiny film clip back into its protective paper sleeve, I felt a sharp, burning cold on the tip of my left index finger. I flinched, pulling my hand back as if I'd been stung. I looked down. The fingertip was stained a deep, inky black, and imprinted on the skin like a tiny, permanent black stamp was the distinct, shimmering outline of that impossible geometric monolith. It's been 3 days. It won't wash off. I've scrubbed it with soap, with alcohol, with bleach. Nothing works. The mark is a part of my skin now, and something else has started happening. I'll be working or driving or just sitting at home, and I'll catch something out of the corner of my eye. Now, whenever I glance quickly into my peripheral vision, I can swear I see it. A faint, dark shape. The shape of that eye, just on the edge of what I'm supposed to be seeing, watching me. Thank you for listening to my story. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more tales from the archives. Stay safe out there. This is a statement regarding the mahogany-framed mirror I purchased at the estate sale on Elm Street last month. I bought it because of the intricate carvings on the frame, vines and weeping angels. It now hangs in my bedroom, and I wish to God I had left it in that dusty, empty house. It started subtly. I'm a creature of habit, you know. Every morning I stand in front of it to tie my tie. One day my reflection's tie was already tied. I just stood there staring at the glass, completely confused. I looked down at my own neck, and my tie was still undone. I blinked, and the reflection corrected itself. A trick of the light, I told myself. The mirror glass is old and silvered, probably warped from age. It was easy to dismiss. But the corrections, they started getting slower. 2 days later, I was brushing my teeth. My reflection just paused, toothbrush held midair, for a full half second after I had already stopped moving. It was incredibly unnerving, like watching a video feed buffering. When I smiled at the discrepancy, just a little nervous smile, my reflection didn't smile back immediately. Its eyes remained fixed on me, wide and strangely hollow for a beat too long, before the corners of its mouth finally lifted into this perfect, empty imitation of my own. That delay, that brief moment of autonomy, that was the first real chill that went down my spine. Then came the intrusion. I was getting ready for bed, undressing, and when I looked into the mirror, the version of me in the reflection was standing there, fully clothed. Not in my clothes either. It was a dark, unfamiliar shirt I'd never seen before, and I definitely don't own. It wasn't the clothes that made me panic, though. It was the smell. An intense, acrid smell suddenly filled the room, the stench of stale cigarette smoke and unwashed wool, so heavy it was suffocating. The scent seemed to pour out from the reflected figure. My actual room was clean, scentless. I spun around, checking behind me, confirming the room was empty, the air fresh. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was still wearing that dark shirt. And this time, it wasn't just standing there. Its head was slightly tilted, and it was watching the area behind me, over my shoulder, with this expression of intense, quiet curiosity. I felt this cold pressure on my upper back, as if something invisible had just leaned in close. I stood there completely paralyzed, just watching my double in the glass. It slowly reached up, lifting its reflected hand, and very, very gently, it placed its index fingertip onto the glass from the inside. Tap. The sound wasn't reflected. It was real. A sharp, hard click that echoed in the quiet room. ENT. I squeezed my eyes shut, screaming internally, and stumbled backward until I hit the opposite wall. When I opened my eyes, the reflection was gone. The mirror was just glass, showing my terrified, sweating face and the empty room behind me. I stayed awake until dawn. I avoided the mirror all day yesterday, but tonight I knew I had to look. I had to know. I walked up to it, my heart just hammering against my ribs. And there it was, just me, normal. I slowly raised my hand and touched the cold glass just to be sure. And there, stuck neatly to the very center of the mirror's surface, was a single, used cigarette butt. It was dry, perfectly cylindrical, and it still smelled faintly of that stale, thick smoke. I know I left the mirror alone for 2 days. The reflection, it's in the room with me and it's not finished. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever had an experience like this, please share it in the comments below. Stay safe, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling tales. I'll see you in the next one.